Which one? Just curious. Okay. And
Checking. That work? Good. Is that good, or you want more talking? And I'll keep talking until you say I'm good. Okay, thanks.
The Subcommittee on Information Technology and the Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order. And without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare recess at any time. I'd like to now recognize my friend and partner in crime, the distinguished gentlewoman from the great state of Illinois, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not too much crime, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Meadows, for holding this important hearing. Ms. Kent, welcome to today's hearing, and thank you for testifying today and sharing your vision for cybersecurity as a new federal CIO. And it was great to meet you in my office. And Mr. Dodaro, special thanks to you for the extensive work you and all the dedicated professionals at GAO put into providing this special mid-cycle high-risk report on cybersecurity, and it was nice meeting with you also. GAO's newly issued report raises serious concerns about our nation's ability to confront cybersecurity risk. GAO found key deficiencies that could hinder the government's progress in strengthening the nation's cyber defenses. For example, GAO found that the Trump administration's plans failed to include basic components needed to carry out a national strategy for protecting critical cyber infrastructure. Among the missing components were details about performance measurements and milestones for determining whether the country's cyber objectives were being met and the resources that would be needed to carry out those objectives. GAO's report highlights the need for the administration to develop and execute a more comprehensive federal strategy for national cybersecurity and global cyberspace. It underscores the importance of having a cybersecurity coordinator in the White House to develop a more robust cybersecurity strategy for the country. But here again, the Trump administration is not rising to the challenge. 2 months ago, the President's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, eliminated the position of White House Cybersecurity Coordinator. This decision was contrary to a prior GAO recommendation to have a White House Cybersecurity Coordinator in the Executive Office of the President develop an overarching federal cybersecurity strategy. At a time when our nation is facing persistent cyber threats ranging from foreign adversaries who seek to undermine our elections to criminal hackers who steal sensitive data, the administration's decision to eliminate a key cybersecurity position in the White House should raise alarm. Today's report also shows that the number of Americans whose personal information has been compromised in government and private sector data breaches is growing, and there is a need for stronger measures and congressional action to protect consumer privacy. GAO found that the vast number of individuals potentially affected by data breaches at federal agencies and private sector entities in recent years increases concerns that personally identifiable information is not being properly protected. GAO's findings is supported by 2 recent reports that highlight the heightened challenge public and private sector organizations are facing in securing sensitive data. In April, Verizon issued a report showing that in the past 12 months alone, there were over 53,000 incidents and 2,216 confirmed data breaches. And just last week, the Attorney General's Cyber Digital Task Force released a report showing that there were at least 686 data breaches reported in the first quarter of 2018, resulting in the theft of as many as 1.4 billion records. Last year, data breaches at Equifax, in which over 143 million Americans had their personal information stolen, and the 2015 breach at OPM, which affected approximately 22.1 million individuals, illustrates the massive scale of harm to privacy and security that these breaches have. To address the growing concerns about privacy, GAO recommended that Congress straighten out privacy laws, the majority of which were written well before the development of new technologies, ranging from the use of social networking sites to facial recognition technologies and many mobile applications. Congress should heed GAO's recommendations and re-examine how our privacy laws can be strengthened to ensure that consumers' personal privacy is adequately protected. I want to thank our witnesses for testifying today, and I normally would say I look forward to hearing your testimony, but I have to leave. But I look forward to reading it on how we can improve the nation's cybersecurity, and thank you again, my friend, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon, y'all. Today's hearing returns to a familiar field for this subcommittee, an area of top bipartisan concern and focus, and that's the cybersecurity of the federal government. The federal government and our federal agencies, like everything else in today's digital society, are dependent on IT systems and electronic data, which make them highly vulnerable to a wide and evolving array of cyber threats. Federal civilian agencies reported over 35,000 information security incidents to the U.S. CERT last fiscal year. This represents a 14% increase over the previous year. Securing federal systems and data is vital to this nation's security, prosperity, and well-being. It should concern all of us, therefore, that the GAO has concluded in the interim high-risk report that spurred this hearing that urgent actions are needed to address ongoing cybersecurity challenges in the federal government. In this report, GAO identified 4 major cybersecurity challenges: establishing a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy and performing effective oversight, securing federal systems and information, protecting cyber critical infrastructure, and protecting privacy and sensitive data. To address these 4 challenges, GAO identified 10 critical actions the federal government and other entities need to take, and I'm looking forward to exploring those 10 items. Since 2010, GAO has made over 3,000 recommendations to agencies aimed at addressing these 4 cybersecurity challenges. And as of June of this year, nearly 1,000 of those recommendations have not been implemented. It's not acceptable, given the threat we face. These open, lingering vulnerabilities put us at incredible risk, as we saw with the devastating data breaches at OPM. While I do not expect Ms. Kent or anyone else to have all the answers today, I want to hear from GAO the most critical open recommendations, and from Ms. Kent, concrete plans to close them. I commend Mr. Dodaro and his team at GAO for issuing this report. Mid-cycle updates to the high-risk list are not common. I recommend all agencies, CIOs, read this report and apply the applicable recommendations to their respective agencies and systems, because guess what? We're going to be asking you about them. And as always, I'm honored to explore these issues in a bipartisan fashion with Ranking Member Kelly, Chairman Meadows, and Ranking Member Connolly. Now, the 4 of us have worked together for years on these issues, and I'm honored to be joined here with them throughout today's hearing. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our witnesses. The Honorable Gene Dodaro, Comptroller General of the United States Government Accountability Office. You always hold a special place in my heart because you were my first hearing being in Congress. Mr. Dodaro is accompanied by Mr. Gregory C. Wilshusen, the Director of Information Security Issues at GAO, who will also be sworn in, and Ms. Suzette Kent, Federal Chief Information Officer at the Office of Management and Budget. I think it's your first time here. I don't think it's the first time testifying in Congress, but welcome. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative, and in order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. The entire written statement has been made part of the record, and as a reminder, the clock will show your time remaining. When it's yellow, you have 30 seconds. When it's red, your time is up. And remember to press the button. And we'll start with Mr. Dodaro. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the committees that are here today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss this important topic. This is an area that's been of long concern to me. We at GAO designated cybersecurity across the federal government as a high-risk area in 1997. So nobody could say we didn't warn people that this was going to be a problem. In 2003, we expanded that high-risk designation to include critical infrastructure protection, and in 2015, we included the need to protect personally identifiable sensitive information as well. Now, the government has taken a number of actions, especially since the OPM breach, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned. There's been executive orders, strategies, documents, studies, but there still much more needs to be done in this area. As you referenced in your opening statement, since 2010, we've made over 3,000 recommendations. While 2/3 of those have been implemented, there's still 1,000 recommendations that need action. Now, the 4 areas that we identified I think are especially important. First is establishing a comprehensive strategy, and importantly, having effective mechanisms in place to oversee its effective implementation. And this is to include global supply chain issues, critical workforce issues, and dealing with emerging technologies that are going to bring new risks, such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, quantum computing. Secondly, there needs to be more urgent action to secure the federal information systems. There needs to be more effective implementation of government-wide efforts like continuous diagnostics and mitigation. Agencies need to fix their systems. There needs to be more attention in responding effectively when incidents do occur over time. We've seen agencies be slow to implement effective actions over time. On critical infrastructure protection, and this is an area that needs a lot more federal attention. Now, in many areas, the federal government has some regulatory responsibilities in this area, but by and large, critical infrastructure protection is a voluntary effort by the private sector. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology have developed an approach that the private sector can use, but it's all voluntary. So there's really not a clear picture, in my opinion, across the different sectors. And there are 16 different sectors of the economy that make up critical infrastructure, including electricity grid, telecommunications, nuclear issues, utilities, et cetera, financial markets area as well. So these are vital to our economic health, they're vital to public health and safety, and there needs to be more collaboration and a better understanding of to what extent have these voluntary standards been implemented by the various sectors and what is their state of readiness to deal with these issues. The fourth area deals with privacy. Now here, federal agencies themselves need to better secure sensitive information. We've issued reports recently on need to protect Medicare beneficiary data, for example, electronic health information systems, data on federal student loans. There's a lot of sensitive personnel data there, financial data that families submit. So that needs to be dealt with definitely, and we need to think about what information the federal government will collect going forward. We've made some recommendations on need to eliminate unnecessary use of Social Security information, for example. But we also have recommendations to the Congress in this area. The Privacy Act was passed in 1974. The Electronic Government Act was passed in 2002. They need updated as well. And we've recommended since 2013 that the Congress establish a consumer privacy framework for the private sector. In those areas, the federal government has put out, in some sectors, health care and credit reporting, some requirements for the private sector, but by and large, the federal government has not set requirements for this area, particularly as it relates to information resellers as well. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I asked our team to put together this special report because I don't think the federal government's moving at a pace commensurate with the evolving threat in this area, and we need all to work harder, faster to address this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. Ms. Kent, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for opening remarks.
Chairman Hurd, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Kelly, Ranking Member Conley, and members of the committees, thank you for having me here today. I am honored to be here to speak with you, and I appreciate all the forums that inspire more aggressive actions towards improving federal cybersecurity. My goal today is to share with you the progress that has been made against the areas highlighted by the Comptroller General, but more important, to share the perspectives on what still needs to be done. And I'd like to engage your continued support on that. Advancement of our cybersecurity posture, both at agency levels and across the federal enterprise, is one of the most important parts of my job. Tomorrow will actually mark 5 months serving at OMB as the Federal Chief Information Officer. And I joined from the financial services industry where the bar is high for cybersecurity and data protection, and I bring that same high bar of expectations to my role as Federal CIO. I was fortunate to come into the role when the administration was setting out the President's management agenda that focuses on technology modernization, data accountability and transparency, and building the workforce of the 21st century. Cybersecurity is a core component of the PMA's IT modernization goals. It's also embedded in the work that we are driving under other goals. The goals for sharing quality services and improving IT spending have elements that drive the use of modern technologies and industry best practices to improve our overall cyber posture. Additionally, the PMA stresses strategies for recruiting, retaining, and reskilling our federal IT and cybersecurity workforce, because our current status is as much a people issue as it is a technology issue. While the PMA outlines the critical areas of focus, OMB's statutory cybersecurity roles are predominantly defined by the E-Government Act of 2002 and the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. Our roles align to three main things: development of policy and oversight for the federal civilian systems, assisting agencies with data analysis and budget, and gathering evidence that promotes solutions that achieve these policies and standards. To carry out the responsibilities, we work closely with agency technology leaders, DHS, Nist, DoD, the intelligence community, and the National Security Council. But because cybersecurity requires deep expertise, both about technology and the mission functions, it does take a collaborative approach to address both the agency-specific and enterprise demands. I am united with the Federal Inspector General community in the mission of securing our systems and data on a journey that actually doesn't end. The improvements in federal cybersecurity outlined in GAO's report are due to a focus on accountability, and it's my goal to further advance the culture of continuous evolution of our cyber capabilities and our workforce to tackle the things that we still must do. In May of 2017, the President signed Executive Order 13800 regarding strengthening cybersecurity of federal networks. This executive order recognized that we need to defend the security of citizen information and ensure the agencies consider cybersecurity as a vital part of their core mission. As part of this EO, the White House also published a report to the President on federal IT modernization, which included 52 tasks, such as safeguarding high-value assets, network consolidation, use of commercial cloud solutions, and strengthening identity management tactics. I share with you today that 37 of those 52 tasks have been completed, many of them ahead of schedule, and we intend to complete the remaining tasks by the end of the year. Executive Order 13800 also directed OMB to develop the Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report and an action plan. Together, OMB and DHS conducted agency risk management assessments to measure agency cybersecurity capabilities and very specifically their risk mitigation approaches. This report did evidence that there's still much to do to improve the awareness of the threat environment, and we're using these findings to prioritize both the investments and the focus of resources. There are other key initiatives I'll quickly highlight. As chair of the Technology Modernization Board, I'm excited by the way this vehicle supports acceleration of modernization, and we appreciate the funding that Congress provided this year, and we hope to receive funding for next year. We are focused on enhancing CIO authorities, and lastly, and most importantly, we are updating old policies, policies that are not effective given the current state of technology capabilities. We're delivering new policies for high-value assets, data centers, continuous monitoring, cloud technologies, and network optimization in the next coming months. In closing, I'm fortunate to take on this role with a clear and focused technology agenda. Cybersecurity has to underpin everything we're doing, from acquisition to operations, because the battle is continuous, and our effort to raise the bar and outpace our adversaries is a mission imperative for every agency. I look forward to working with Congress and the leaders across the federal government agencies to be aggressive and relentless about improving federal cybersecurity, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you, Ms. Kent. Now we'll go to the first round of questions. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Dodaro, good seeing you again. And Ms. Kent, congratulations on your recent position. Last year, fiscal year 2017, federal civilian agencies reported over 35,000 information security incidents. That's a stunning number, about a 15% increase from the previous year. This is really to both of you to begin with. What's driving that increase?
I think there's at least two things. One, there's a better awareness on the part of the agencies to report incidents which do occur. But I also think that it's being driven in part by a more aggressive activity on the part of state and non-state actors to try to penetrate the federal government systems. This applies to critical infrastructure protection as well. And so I think it's, you know, both factors are at play here at a minimum.
I concur, and we do see an increase across the entire industry in threats, but you also see the increase in reporting, and that's something that we need to continue to move more aggressively across all of the agencies.
All right, so it's both and. We're having more incidents, more attacks, and we're also getting better at detecting them.
Yes.
All right, can you walk me through some of the various means that attackers use to initiate some sort of cyber attack, the threat vectors? What's most common? What's most preventable, Mr. Dodaro?
There's, you know, phishing attacks have been particularly prominent lately in terms of somebody sending an email to someone in the hopes that they'll download malicious code or other factors. There's, you know, social engineering that takes place in those areas as well. There's one of the largest categories, though, in the reporting is other. And other includes they don't know what the threat vector was and how people were able to penetrate the system. That is one of the most concerning aspects of this.
All right, I want to get there. What are the vectors? When you talk about vectors, you've got phishing, you've got, what else? What are we dealing with?
Yeah, we have a pie chart in our testimony. Let me just pull that up here.
Improper usage, email and phishing,
Right.
lost and theft of equipment, and other web-based attacks.
Okay, so those comprise more or less 70%. Then you mentioned 31%.
Right.
That other. So does that mean we have no idea how they're breaking in or what they're doing, or what does that mean?
That means that it's unknown in some of these cases how these things have occurred. I mean, that's the concerning part of this, and that's one of the points that we make in the report. That's why it's important to have an effort to detect these things when they occur. What's been reported in these cases, I mean, the attacks happen in a matter of minutes, but the detection doesn't occur for months later, and that impairs the ability to determine exactly what happened that led to this attack situation.
All right, Ms. Kent, do you want to add to that, your definition or whatever of other?
I would just add to the last point that Mr. Dodaro made, is that we have identified that we have to move much more quickly when an attack is identified to not only share that threat information across agencies, but to act and begin immediate remediation of those issues.
All right, once an attack comes in, particularly I'm with you concerned about the other, where we have no idea how they're getting in, is there any way of tracking where they're coming from?
Some of that's possible with some forensics, but in some cases there's not clear audit trails in the systems that are created in the documentation there. You know, one of the big problems, Congressman, here is that, you know, the federal government and a lot of agencies are saddled with these legacy financial systems that are like a millstone around their neck. They're old systems. They were designed before security was a prominent area. Some of them at IRS are from the 60s. And so there's not good documentation, and therefore there's not a good audit trail to follow to figure out how things were introduced.
Which is surprising to me and kind of inexcusable, seeing the tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars we give for IT on an annual basis around here. It just amazes me that we're still using such legacy systems. Seems like
of the billions of dollars that you give every year, 80, 90 billion, 75% of it goes to maintain these legacy systems.
Rather than get updated.
Rather than get updated. So that's why we added IT acquisitions and operations across the government as a high-risk area in 2015.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
The representative from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I must say, not only do I appreciate our guests appearing, I appreciate the committee for having this hearing, because frankly, I think Americans are increasingly terrified, wondering if anybody's protecting their cybersecurity. And the reason I think so is what we're hearing, even on mass media. This is really an old problem. How many years ago was it? This very committee had a hearing on how our federal employees had been penetrated, and the Congress actually, at that time, gave federal employees 10 years of protection against further penetration. By the way, I'm sure that's running. I'm not sure how long it has to go. I have a bill called the Recover Act. In light of the negligence of the federal government, it seems to me that the very least we could do would be to give lifetime coverage, and that's been sufficiently long ago, more than 5 years ago, that I think it's going to come up again soon, and we're going to be faced with that question for our own employees. Now, this committee had a recent hearing, and if you want to get, you want to frighten our people, the head of the DHS, Undersecretary, testified that the Russians were already scanning, that's the word he used, all 50 states. He couldn't tell me that all 50 states, they were doing something in all 50 states. It sounds like reconnaissance. We're looking to see when to hop and whom to hop upon. So I'm very interested, particularly since I represent so many federal employees that were among those first implicated. And Mr. Dodaro, I'd like to ask you about federal strategy. I'd like to be able to say I left this hearing and I learned something that should put some of my own constituents at ease. Would you tell me what the federal strategy is for protecting national cybersecurity here and penetration globally from outside of the United States? Do you have access to such a national strategy?
There are several documents that have been put forward by the executive branch. DHS,
would you call that a national cybersecurity strategy?
Well,
and what do you mean by documents? Would you tell us what a document does?
Sure. You know, well, first of all, our main point today is there's a need for a more comprehensive national strategy.
There must be something. If you say a more comprehensive,
right. But there has been a foundation laid by the government for these strategies. DHS has a strategy that they put forward. They're responsible for coordinating across the federal government and with critical infrastructure protections, and they've laid out a number of the components of that strategy. But we found they didn't identify what resources they needed, how they were going to determine they were making progress.
Since several agencies would be involved, who should be in charge of coordinating the development of a cybersecurity strategy?
Well, it needs
national cybersecurity strategy.
Yeah. You need to have either an individual or an entity or a process in order to be able to have somebody to coordinate in this area.
With more than a number of agencies involved, who would you suggest the GAO might be?
Well, it needs to be let out of the White House.
It needs to be let out of the White House.
In my opinion, because you're dealing with national and global issues in this case. Now,
that's where the coordination needs to happen, and I appreciate that.
Well, it needs to happen at all levels, but
somebody needs to be in charge. My concern, Mr. Dodaro, is I can't say to my constituents, don't worry about it. Either some agency is in charge or somebody in the White House is in charge. What about milestones? Are there, at least in what has been put forward by individual agencies, milestones so that I could say to my own constituents, well, they're this far along, and here's an example. That's what people are looking for.
Right.
Assure me, reassure me.
No, we would like to see more milestones. DHS has told us, for example, they're working on their strategy. It's supposed to be out next month that would identify milestones that would include the resources and the performance measures. So we'll wait to see. But that's supposed to be forthcoming.
Ms. Kent, finally, let me ask you, because you are dealing with the IT strategy for the federal government. Do you have milestones, and where are we when it comes to helping agencies rationalize these policies so that there is at least government-wide such a IT strategy? Are they milestones? Who's implementing them? Who's in charge? Are you in charge? You're the chief financial officer, or please detail that.
There are indeed milestones, and many of the points that have been made around deployment of continuous diagnostic and monitoring tools, securing agency data, modernizing their technology are part of the milestones that we are tracking. You did see in the report that we are behind across the agencies on some of those. So we have a very specific focus. There was a milestone set for deployment of the continuous diagnostic and monitoring tools. We have not met that milestone, and we're working very aggressively with the
What are monitoring tools, please?
to be able to, for all of the agencies to have implemented tracking capabilities so that they know what is on their network.
Yeah, I'm worried about the scanning, for example.
Yes. So that we know who is accessing their network.
Yeah.
And what. And so we were working very aggressively with DHS. And one of the critical things that we did as part of the President's management agenda was reassess high-value assets. I am pleased to say that we had 100% participation from every agency to identify those assets that are most critical, applications and data, and we're working with DHS on those that are most critical for next set of activities.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I think the committee needs to do more to press the milestone notion so that we can reassure the American people that we're getting there and how soon we're going to get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pursue a little bit the question that my colleague had a few moments ago about these 35,000 plus, quote, incidents. Can you define, Mr. Dodaro, a little more carefully what an incident is in your interpretation? Turn your mic on, sir. I'm sorry. Thank
I'm
you.
going to ask Mr. Wilshusen to explain those. He's our expert in that area.
Because these incidents aren't just someone tinkering around trying to scan your system. Please define them a little more carefully.
Right. These would be incidents that actually have impacted an agency operation or so. They're able to gain access, and they do this through a number of different mechanisms. One of the more common ones is just through what is known as a phishing attack,
sure.
in which you send an email with the link and someone clicks on it and it sends them to a
Sends
corrupted
malware and-
website or downloads some malicious
Either
software.
malware, yeah, okay.
It can also be the loss or theft of equipment that contains sensitive information as well.
Sure.
So there are a number of different types of incidents, but these are ones that do have an impact or can have an impact on the agency.
Now, Mr. Dale, you referenced earlier that state and non-state actors has been suggested, as this discussion's already started, that, again, we're back to Russia. These state actors, examples of state actors impacting our systems go far beyond Russia, do they not?
Yes, they do. I mean, some of the intelligence community has singled out, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, as, actors in this area as well.
I'll run the risk of, offending some people by saying that I believe occasionally some of our allies actually occasionally are trying to wander around our systems too.
It could be. I mean, I would defer to the intelligence community for those
I'll let them get into it. But,
responses.
I want to stress the reality is we face threats both internally and externally to our cybersecurity. When an incident happens, Ms. Kent, what's the time frame by which you're informed we have some level of an incident?
There are various timeframes depending on the incident and when the agency identifies the particular activity. You just heard there's different types of issues and incidents. Some of those may be very quick. Others may be a longer time frame. And as Mr. Gadaro indicated, particularly in situations where there is some type of malware or an attempt to—
Let me stop you. I appreciate it. You've got, I understand they can't inform you until they know about them. That's problem one. We'll get to that in a moment. Problem two is that the prime frame when they have knowledge there's an incident. What's the expectation? Let's change that. What's the expectation that you've put out, the White House has put out to inform you that we have an incident of some form? What's the expectation?
The expectation is that the agency informed DHS, who is looking at our enterprise risk, and we are tracking
And what's
all
the time frame
agencies
on that? Once more, what is the time frame on that?
as immediately as they know,
So theoretically, the same day, next day, that night, whatever the case may be.
as quickly as they have identified the incident.
When do you find out about it?
I find out in reports from DHS.
Which is, takes what kind of time frame?
Depends on the type of incident.
Go ahead, give me examples.
I don't actually have an example.
Okay. Let me ask you a question if I can, Mr. Darrow. That's the Fisma audits that are done. In your opinion, are they sufficient, and are action being taken on those audits at this point in time?
They're a starting point because they're supposed to identify a comprehensive information security system. We find that there are deficiencies in all aspects: access controls, segregation of duties, configuration management, contingency planning. And they're not remedied as quickly as possible. So there are serious security weaknesses that have existed for years in a number of the Fisma audits that the agencies are in place. Now, but there needs to be more done because they need to have better response when they find incidents.
Who's responsible for that follow-up on?
Well, each agency is responsible for their own actions, and this is an issue because they're not correcting the problems fast enough, in my opinion. That's why we have it as a designated high-risk area across the entire Federal Government. Virtually every agency has serious weaknesses, and I don't think enough attention is focused by agency managers on getting these areas fixed. We've made recommendations to OMB that they send out more guidance to the agencies to hold senior leaders accountable for getting these weaknesses fixed.
One of the things that astonished me, and my time has expired here, but let me finish this one comment, Mr. Chair, is that when I first joined Congress and joined this committee, I was astonished by the number of agency chief information officers. That, how do you get someone leading when you've got all of these people doing their own thing? I mean, Ms. Kent, you were in the private sector, and I am short on time, so I can't. That didn't happen in your world, now did it?
It did not, and that's also one of the focuses that we have had both under FATARA as well as the recent executive order to have a single CIO that has accountability, responsibility, and visibility across the entire agency so that we can move the types of things that we were talking about much more quickly.
And with that, when there's an incident, they should tell DHS and they should tell you at the same time.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry.
The distinguished gentleman from Iowa is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd. Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. Ms. Kent, good to see you. Thank you for appearing today. I'm going to change gears a little bit, and I'd like to hear from you your expertise on cloud computing. I understand the Department of Defense is going to have a private company in the private sector host via the cloud a lot of government data. And I don't know, my first reaction is, it concerns me a little bit, concerns people in my district when they hear that. Maybe I shouldn't assume anything. Do you feel confident that this data will be more secure than if it were with the federal government, and why?
Cloud computing offers a potential for, first of all, cost savings and more rapidly updating of the systems that are used in place. As we mentioned, these legacy systems have been in the federal government for a long period of time, and that's a big problem. If you go to the cloud, then the updating of those systems become responsibility there. Now, that being said, there are cost efficiencies, and other efficiencies that could be gained. The security is paramount issue that needs to be addressed. We're looking now, there's a program that's supposed to ensure that there's security over the cloud operations. It's called FedRAMP is the acronym for it. And we're looking to see if it's an effective tool to make sure there's adequate security in the cloud operations. Now, the last point I'd make is that the Federal Government's own record of security is pretty abysmal. So, you know, as a starting point, so I don't think, you know, everybody have a total confidence that everything's fine now, and it may be worse later if we move to the cloud. But you have to be careful in making the move to the cloud environment to make sure there's adequate security.
So more secure is what you feel, I guess, than today.
It could be, but we need to take care to make sure the requirements are there, they're set properly, there's adequate testing, there's certification, there's requirements and operations. It offers a lot of potential for savings, cost savings for the Federal Government, and more up-to-date systems that are patched properly and in place. But the security remains as much of a concern with the cloud environment as it does with the Federal agencies, and we need to take due care.
Ms. Kent?
Yes, sir, I agree that it can definitely be secure, and in many cases, it is maintained in a way that we have seen we have not necessarily done across some of the Federal systems. I would add two other things to what Mr. Guerrero said, is that there is a discipline around understanding the data and what we're moving to the cloud and how we control access to that. And that is a discipline that we're trying to drive with the agencies as they're considering their transformations and the cloud technologies that they're using. So it's a combination of the security that's available with the technology, what we're putting there, and how we manage access to that information. And so those are the disciplines that that my office is working directly with the agencies as they consider these acquisitions.
Mr. Dodaro, we often hear things like the Federal Government was slow to respond to an emerging threat, especially cybersecurity threats. What have you found in that regard? And why?
It brings a new definition of slowness, okay? In this area, you know, we first designated it as a high-risk area across the Federal Government in 1997. So I've been trying for over 20 years to get attention to this area. You know, we actually built a computer lab facility that could simulate the operating environment of agencies in the early 90s and actually did penetration testing to get people's attention that there could be issues that needed to be dealt with. And it took a long time, but we finally convinced the Congress. Legislation began being introduced in 2000, 2002, creating the Federal Information Management Act, the Fisma Act. That was updated, and it really wasn't until the OPM breach that in 2015, you know, this is, so many years later, that agencies began to move and the administration began to move. But even then, to this day, I'm not sure OPM has fixed all the weaknesses that led to the original data breach. We've went in a couple of times, and we haven't found the problem. So it's perplexing to me that there hasn't been enough urgency associated with dealing with this issue, and I'm pleased to hear from Ms. Kent and others that they're going to sort of up the game here to be aggressive in this area. But there's no question that there has been adequate warnings about these areas that GAO has been given. It's been on our top risk list for many years, both within the Federal Government, but also critical infrastructure protection. We put that on in 2003. And concerned about the electricity grid, the financial markets, telecommunications, and we're moving in that area, but that's, right now it's all voluntary on part of the private sector, and I can understand that, but we need to have a partnership and more information exchange between the private sector and the other sector. I mean, this is a national security issue. not just, a privacy issue, and privacy's been slow too. We've recommended that the Congress change update the privacy laws. The original Privacy Act is 1974. E-Government Act in 2002. Many things have changed since then. There needs to be updated information. And while the Congress has only identified some sectors of the economy, healthcare, credit reporting, to put in place rights for consumers about data that's collected about them, there is no consumer privacy framework. We've recommended that Congress consider creating one since 2013. So, we've been urging for a long time now more attention to this area. I'm glad that we're having this hearing, but I think the pace of change needs to pick up quite a bit because the threat's evolving way faster than the government's ability to deal with it.
I heard the phrase, and I'll end with this, the warfare of the future may not be bombs, it may be bits and bytes, not bombs. And I know we spend a lot of money on bombs, and we should, but I think we need to give attention to bits and bytes, cybersecurity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In conventional warfare, the first thing that people do is take out your communication systems, take out your transportation structure, your ability to have power. But to do that, you'd have to physically invade the country. Today, that's not exactly the same. You could do it from your own country.
Thank you for your insights, and I yield back the time I do not have, Mr. Chairman.
I generally try to have a PMA, a positive mental attitude. My dad taught me that, and I think there has been some bright spots over the last 3.5 years since I've been in Congress. Federal CIOs have more power than they have in the past. They're getting more involved in the procurement process because we can't hold federal CIOs accountable if they don't have the responsibilities on what goes on their network. And that's something that this committee has fought for in a very bipartisan way. I believe when we first started this committee, there were only 4 CIOs that reported to the agency head or deputy agency head. I think now there's only 4 that do not, and I believe by the end of the year, there would only be 1 that is probably not reporting that. So again, empowering the men and women in the CIO. I've been surprised over the last few months. I've had a number of businesses say that they are happy with improved sharing of intelligence threat information between the federal and the private sector. Now that's part of DHS's role, and I think DHS is the only entity that can get into that mode of need to share. And we are seeing what DHS is able to do, and their technical capabilities to help across the other 24 CFO agencies, I think, are improving. And one of the things that is leading to and causing us see the number of threats increase, because guess what? DHS is doing their job, right? Now, having done this kind of work before, guess what? I'm always going to get in. How quickly can you detect me? How quickly can you quarantine me? And how quickly can you kick me out is the mentality that we need to be in. But why are some basic things, like Megabyte Act? Megabyte Act says every agency should know what software they have on their networks. Is that hard to do, Mr. Dodaro?
No.
Ms. Kent, is that hard? Is that a hard thing to do, to be able to catalog the software that you have on your system?
No, sir, we have an opportunity to do much better.
And so what is what more do we need to do to drive that behavior? Megabyte's important, knowing what your software is, and that's why we've added it onto the FITARA scorecard. FITARA scorecard is evolving into a digital hygiene scorecard. Naming and shaming is really what we're doing. We're trying to give CIOs the authority with MGT, the Modernization Government Technology Act, to get out of this notion of if you don't use it, you lose it. So now there's motivation to modernize. What other carrot sticks should we be using, or do you need, in order to compel compliance on some very basic things like knowing what software you have?
First, I have to applaud and say thank you for the continuous focus on the FITARA scorecard, because having that level of transparency does make it a priority. To your point on Megabyte, there are tools and technologies that we can do that with, especially if it is a priority. One of the things that I would ask that would be of great assistance is the continued focus on workforce activities. In many cases, we still have almost a 25% gap in the number of cybersecurity resources that we need across federal agencies and what we actually have in place. And particularly, we have some gaps in leadership and individuals places where we have open positions that are key leaders. In many cases, the individuals, when we get them in, their tenure is less than 12 to 18 months. So there are multiple workforce actions, both at entry level and at leadership, and there are things that we continue dialogues with the private sector to see if we can fill those gaps.
Do we still believe, is the number still 15,000 roughly IT positions that are unfilled across the federal government?
Yes, sir.
How is the process going to catalog what those positions are? Because we don't have common job descriptions across the federal government. This is something that OPM was supposed to be working on. I'd welcome an update on this initiative.
We are making good progress on that, at clarifying the specific positions as well as common nomenclature, particularly the CIO Council recently published a CISO handbook to ensure that we are holding our cybersecurity teams accountable for the same standards of behavior across all of the agencies. But we still have work to do to fill those positions, and particularly in the entry levels, to ensure that potentially we are identifying other skill sets in the federal government that we can move into some of those positions.
So when will we have a common picture of what positions are open and what these positions are going to be?
I know that it is in the works, and I will get the date back to you.
Mr. Dodaro, you mentioned your written remarks, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education Cybersecurity Workforce Framework. Is that ringing a bell?
It'll ring. It'll ring
his
Mr.
bell?
Will's shoes,
Yeah.
ring his bell, right?
It does.
Wait, what is that? Where are we? You know, the report recommends, and y'all's report recommends that this is something that is not being addressed properly. Can you give us a little bit more context to this?
Sure, absolutely. The Nist cybersecurity workforce is an attempt to kind of have a common language and designation for cybersecurity and IT-related activities. And the intent under the Federal Cybersecurity Workforce Assessment Act, federal agencies are required to assess their cybersecurity workforce, identify the specific functions associated with each of those positions or their IT and cyber positions, and then assign codes to it in the attempt to identify critical areas of need as it relates to cyber. We issued a report last month that showed that 13 out of the 24 agencies that we examined had not performed all of the activities that it was required, or they were required to do. And we ended up making about 30 recommendations to those 13 agencies. We have ongoing work continuing, following up on the status of those recommendations and agencies' actions to finish implementation of the requirements of that act.
Good copy. We will come back on a round two, and now I'd like to recognize my friend from New York, Ms. Maloney, for her 5 minutes.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member and all of the panelists. Mr. Dodaro, in the high-risk report that GAO issued today, it states that the vast number of individuals potentially affected by data breaches at federal agencies and private sector outlets increases concern considerably that personally identified information is not being properly protected. And I think I agree with you completely, too, given the breaches that we've seen with Verizon in April They released a report showing that in the past 12 months alone, there was a total of over 53,000 incidents and over 2,200 confirmed data breaches. And then in 2017, we saw the really awful data breach at Equifax, which was over 143 Americans had their personal information stolen. And the 2015 breach at OPM, which affected approximately 22 million individuals, it demonstrates the absolute massive scale of harm to privacy and security that data breaches can have. And this doesn't even get into the alleged foreign governments that are hacking into our private material. The high-risk report states, and I quote, that the laws are currently written may not consistently protect personally identified information in all circumstances of its collection and use, end quote. Can you briefly explain how our current privacy laws and framework for protecting individuals' privacy is not adequate? Obviously, it's not adequate with this large number of breaches taking place. There's some reports that every person in government has been hacked, that everybody's breaking in everywhere. So could you respond to that?
Absolutely. First, the Privacy Act was originally passed in 1974, so it's very dated and did not have anywhere near the context of the current computing environment in place, and what is likely to occur in the future. There was the E-Government Act in 2002. That took a couple of steps, but not sufficient. Here's two examples. One is that the current definition deals with a system of records, that the government's responsibility is protecting that. That doesn't say anything about data mining. It doesn't say anything about databases that are used and scanned and scraped and whatever definition you want to use. So the ability now to be able to manipulate the data is not contemplated under current law. Second, it gives the federal agencies the ability to only use the data for, quote, authorized purposes. Now, that doesn't necessarily give the individuals whose data is being collected an understanding of what is an authorized purpose. So there's really not clarity about what the federal government's limits or abilities are to be able to do with these things. And then
What would you say is an authorized purpose? I mean,
well, it's a lot. Every agency is allowed to define it in their own way, which is
that's
what
not right. I don't.
Well, that's what I'm, what we're saying. Okay. Basically, there needs to be more clarity on exactly.
Could you get back to the committee with an explanation or recommended definition of this? And you went on to say in your report that that we needed to strengthen our consumer privacy laws. Is that right? And
yes.
Could you get back to us on how you would expect us, or to me, on how you'd like us to strengthen it? And if Congress does move forward with amending and updating the nation's privacy laws, which we should, what are the key changes that you believe must be achieved?
Yeah, we will definitely provide all that information to you in detail. On the consumer privacy framework, really, there isn't one, except in the healthcare area and HIPAA, for example, or federal credit reporting, or some other information. Nothing else is really covered, including information reselling of data. And with other technologies, facial recognition technology and other things, there is no consumer financial privacy or no, consumer privacy framework in place, and we've recommended that it be put in place. So we can give you some examples of that.
Please do give that. And I do want to get to OMB for a moment, Ms. Kerr. What is the administration's timeline for implementing GAO's recommendations? Are you implementing these recommendations they put out? Or
We're in process with many of the recommendations, particularly the ones that are in the area of federal systems and information, and actually in the privacy and security area that you just talked about. One of the key elements around how we secure data and citizen data is the efforts under IT modernization. It is very difficult to or complex to secure data in systems that are over 20 years old. And as we modernize, we have better tools for data encryption and management of the data, both at rest and in movement. And that is one of the ways that we protect all information that we have within our federal agency purview against any type of threat.
And very briefly, how can Congress assist you in this really huge effort and very, very important one? It used to be privacy was utmost concern on everyone's mind. And now with terrorism, attacks, and other things, it's not taken the really important level that it should in our country. And I want to express my appreciation for your report. But how can we help you?
Congress can continue to help us through funding of the teams that focus on these efforts, through creative vehicles like the Technology Modernization Fund that let us actually advance the modernization activities much more quickly, as well as the efforts that I spoke of earlier on workforce.
I'm way past time. Thank you for indulging, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
The distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia and ranking member is now recognized for his first 5 minutes of
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your commitment to this subject matter. Mr. Dodaro, I want to thank you and GAO for elevating this particular part of the issue to your high-risk grouping, because it forces us to at least talk about it, hopefully do something about it. And you've been instrumental in the past in supporting our FATAR legislation and our scorecard efforts and the like. And I really credit GAO with helping us make the progress we've made. Last May, the Trump administration, however, eliminated the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator position from the National Security Council. In light of your elevation of this as a high-risk category, in retrospect, was that a prudent move? Was that a welcome move in the context in which you've delineated this subject matter?
I think, yeah, we've just for clarification, we've had this on the high risk list since 1997, so this isn't a recent elevation. I'm concerned that there hasn't been enough progress in addressing this issue. I was, surprised that the position was eliminated. I've been told that those responsibilities have been divided among 2 people. I haven't had a chance, since it's a recent activity, to look into it more. We plan to do that in the future. So once we look into it and see how they're planning to approach it with the elimination of that position, I'll be in a better position to advise the Congress on what to do. We've never really evaluated this cybersecurity coordinator role. We've been more focused on getting a national strategy in place and making clarifications. So we're not really, haven't really examined fully what that position did, what kind of resources they had available, and what their accomplishments were during that period of time. So it's an area that I'm concerned about. You always want to have good leadership, and you can have good leadership in a number of different ways, but I want to look at it more carefully before I advise on exactly what would need to be done differently from what they're contemplating doing.
Yeah, you may be right. I mean, maybe diffusing responsibility or splitting responsibility allows us to have a sum greater, the whole greater than the sum of the parts. On the other hand, there was a report in Politico that said since its creation in 2009, the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator position has been key in resolving conflicts among agencies, preparing cabinet leaders to make major policy decisions, and responding to crises. As you know, Mr. Dodaro, sometimes, maybe more often than not, in government, you need a central focus. You need some champion who is vested with authority and responsibility for moving an agenda, for advocating for a cause. Absent that, often in big bureaucracies, something we all think is a good thing just kind of dies on the vine for lack of attention and championship. And so I would welcome you looking at that, because I think we'd want to know, did the Trump administration make a good decision, or did it make a mistake in abolishing this position? Ms. Kent, do you have views on that? I'm sure you do.
Sir, I don't know that I would, what I would reflect is that the activities for the federal agencies are directed by Homeland Security Advisor Fears. And in fact, my Chief Information Security Officer has a dual reporting relationship between he and I, so that there's no miss or time in translation for things that we need to take action on. And I think I have a very clear set of mandates of actions that we need to take across the federal agencies.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Do you know how long it took to get a CTO?
To get a, I'm sorry?
A Chief Technology Officer, or a CIO for the federal government?
Yes, sir, I do.
In this administration? It was over a year.
Yes, sir.
So I have to tell you, given that record, it's not exactly confidence building that, you've got it and you're moving an agenda, not you personally, but the administration. I mean, words are nice, but actions are important. If I may, Mr. Chairman, because then I'm going to have to run, I have one other subject that is of deep concern to me, and again, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Dodaro, to look into this. So, and I agree with what you said, Ms. Kent, we've been champions about the need to upgrade legacy systems or replace them, and to, come into this part of the 21st century so that we can encrypt, we can protect. But what is, the purpose of technology is to do the job better. It's to be deployed. It's to give us capabilities we otherwise might not have. One of those capabilities is telework. And I can tell you, as someone who lived through 9/11 and has lived through lots of hurricanes and other kinds of things here in the nation's capital, telework increasingly becomes critical to continuity of operations, without which government shuts down. And what has disturbed me is that the Trump administration seems to be going in exactly the wrong direction with respect to telework. Item, the Department of Education issued new guidelines that seem to severely curtail a robust program. USDA, which is highly touted by Jared Kushner and Chris Liddell, and I met with them and had a good meeting, but I did bring to their attention that I felt Secretary Perdue was going in the wrong direction on telework. He actually curtailed that program there. And then your office has issued guidelines that from the White House that actually would limit, as I understand it, telework to be defined as no more than 1 day a week. Now, I don't know anyone in the telework profession who would agree with that definition. No one. Telework is to be encouraged more than 1 day a week. It's a structured program. It's not a spontaneous, gee, I feel like teleworking today. That's not how it works. But we want to get the maximum benefits, and we want to deploy technology, and we want to make sure this is part of the offering for the next generation of federal employee, because millennials expect that as part of the offering. So what is going on here in terms of the reluctance to encourage rather than constrain telework in this administration? I have to confess to you, and then I'll shut up, I was really particularly bothered by this because we actually had a good meeting at the White House where we found common ground, and I reassured Mr. Kushner and Mr. Liddell that, frankly, if they continue going in the direction they described, they'd have our support, which is not an everyday occurrence. And then this happened. And this seems to fly in the face of the kind of progress we thought we were going to make in common.
Sir, I'm not informed on the specific decisions that the agencies made around their policies. I do know that one of the things that we are focused on as part of the President's management agenda and a specific goal is elimination of paper across the various processes in the government to actually free up the ability for individuals to not be dependent on being in a specific physical spot to do that work and drive other efficiencies. In addition, some of the investments that we're making in digital capabilities and new workforce tools actually enable work to be done from a broader reach of locations.
Well, I mean, there's actually explicit policy guidance that's been drafted that would curtail telework in your administration. I'd be glad to get it to you if you haven't seen it. Mr. Dodaro, I would just ask that you look into this because I think it flies in the face of the progress we've tried to make. You know, the whole point here is to deploy the capability, not constrain it. Would welcome GAO to look into this and see if we can.
Be happy to do so.
I thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I'm sorry.
Mr. Mitchell, round 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Connolly, you may want to stay for this conversation at the beginning of it because we were talking about legacy systems. Mr. Dodaro, have you looked at or done any analysis of
I would say to my friend, I would, but I belong to 2 committees that believe no human problem cannot be improved with another hearing. And my other committee is practicing that as we speak.
Only 2 here? Only 2 committees are doing that? I'm shocked. It's getting near district work period, and it's gone. The wheels have come off the bus around here, okay? Let's talk about legacy systems for a moment. Have you done any analysis, any examples of the current cost of maintaining legacy systems versus just making a transition to a new system? And what's the comparison? Give me, if you have some examples, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, overall, what we've said of the annual federal investment, which is about $80–90 billion a year, 75% of that goes to support the legacy systems, as opposed to making investments in modern approaches and systems. So we've looked at a lot of individual cases, and I'd be happy to provide those for the record. But definitely, the government's track record in implementing new systems and being able to retire legacy systems isn't very good. But it needs to be better, and I think the legislation this committee has sponsored is helping move in that right direction. And I always approach this with a PMA as well, a positive mental attitude. But I also have a view of what the realistic track record has been at the agencies. I'm hoping they do better. I hope the CIOs can do better in this area. But we need to make a better job in those areas. So the short answer to your question is the legacy systems involve a lot of spending and are sucking up a lot of the federal government's investment, and we need to get new systems in place. But every time there's an effort to do that, there's a failure on the part of many agencies. Now, hopefully, with Ms. Kent's leadership and elevating the CIOs to have more responsibility in the agencies, we'll see a different outcome going in the future. I certainly hope so.
Well, I'd like to see this example so you could get this to committee with things you've looked at. We'd like to look at, because at some point in time, what we're doing is we're paying costs, workforce costs, to work on legacy systems that should in fact be better.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
a new system.
Yeah, I mean, good example. And we just issued a report about the Coast Guard system that was supposed to be put in place. That failed. The VA, they spent over $1 billion trying to improve the current electronic healthcare system. That hasn't been successful as well. I mean, we got a long list of activities where money has been invested, in a lot of cases millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and it hasn't produced the new system yet properly to retire the legacy system. So we'll get you a list. I'm confident we have one, and it'll touch virtually every agency in the federal government.
Well, we just had a hearing a bit ago on the census, and as you are well aware, they're well behind in terms of developing this. What they do is systems, and they're over budget. So it doesn't surprise me, but we need to start to look at it, so I'd like to see it. Ms. Kent, could I ask you, you mentioned the vacancies. You have about 15,000 vacancies of technical cybersecurity personnel. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What are the primary drivers of those vacancies?
I'm sorry, say that.
What are the primary drivers, causes
Of the vacancies?
Yes.
The primary drivers of the vacancies is that cybersecurity skills are one of the hottest skills in the industry right now, and we are competing with the private sector, as well as the cybersecurity professionals have an expectation of quick mobility, large challenges, and some ability to move very quickly in their profession, and some of those things don't align well.
We've got big challenges, I can guarantee that.
It is a very big challenge, but it's an area where there are many avenues that we're pursuing, both at entry-level positions as well as leadership positions, and continuing to explore exchanges with private sector to fill those gaps.
When we had people leave my company, we always did a survey of kind of get an idea why you're going. I mean, I'm sure you did as well. What's the primary, you average tenure is about 18 months and they're gone. What's the primary causes that people are up and leaving once you get them here?
It is a highly valuable set of skills in the private sector industry. So many times it's a question of compensation. What we have to offer is an exciting mission and the ability, we have many very motivated professionals that come in because they believe in the missions that our agencies are focused on. Other times they are leaving because they want more mobility and mobility as they progress through the professional ranks.
Have there many recommendations made, Mr. Dodaro, on what we do in terms of a compensation scale or a career structure for cybersecurity personnel in the federal system?
No, I mean, this is an area that, we've had strategic human capital management on the high risk list since 2001. One of the areas.
What have you not had on high risk since
Well,
2000?
there's things that aren't high risk. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah. But the problem here is the classification system that OPM has in place. I mean, there's really not been, that system was created many years ago. It didn't contemplate cybersecurity. They've not adapted over time. And so right now, the phase one of what the administration is currently doing is to take stock of what cybersecurity skills exist across the government. I mean, we should have known this for years earlier and developed new systems in place. Now, Congress has been very good here. They've given a lot of special authorities to the agencies, but we found that they have over 100 special hiring authorities, but they only use about a dozen or so. And so it's really, OPM hasn't looked at whether or not the special hiring authorities are being effective or not. And so, this needs more attention. I'm very glad that the President's reorganization proposals focused on cybersecurity workforce.
Can you share with OPM, at least my opinion, it's not necessarily the committee opinion, but my opinion, that I ran a fair-sized company. The chief technology officer reported to me. They reported to me for a reason, and we had a deal. His phone never went off, and as soon as something went sideways, he had warning systems, and you're well aware, Ms. Kennedy, what those are. And the deal was he immediately went in and dealt with the issues. And the next thing he did is he called me, because there is nothing that's more important than securing our data. We were a school group. We had the information on 6,500 students at any point in time, their financial information, their parents' financial information, and that getting hacked is a serious issue, never mind the issues we have here. So suggest to OPM they may want to up the ante on this and make it a little more important, because people aren't trusting our government because they don't believe their data is secure, never mind the issues it creates for us in terms of national security. Thank you. I'm beyond my time as chair as well. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Kent, one of the recommendations in that GAO suggests needs to be improved is the global supply chain of information that's on our federal infrastructure. So if we take the narrow view of the supply chain of software or hardware that is put on a system responsible by the .gov or in the .gov domain, who's responsible for making sure that those widgets are secure?
One of the things that I agree with, the point around supply chain is ensuring that we have a mechanism not only to know what is on our network, but to allow Congress and other bodies to make recommendations and have a structured way that we identify both hardware and software where it is being used, and we have a structured way to pull those things out. We had, as we worked through the Kaspersky situation, we had to create an entire process, communicate that information, and manage it one by one across all of the agencies, and we did not have a systematic way to do that. Since we have now had additional concerns, and those may continue, what we would like to have in place is a structured way to do that and ongoing identification by agencies.
So let me rephrase the question. Who, right now, can you tell agency X, you got to remove all this stuff? You, as the federal CIO, can make that directive, and X agency would have to comply with that.
We have been taking directives from the National Security Council or from others, but yes, that is the way that we have been executing the ones for which we've been given a directive to date.
Can the CIO for that agency make that decision and say, all this stuff is coming out?
The CIOs have responsibility for the security posture of their agencies, so if they decide to take a more aggressive stance on some situation, or for some reason that aligns with their mission, that is within their authority.
So let's say an agency has a device on their network that they shouldn't have. Who should be in trouble? Who is responsible for having allowed that to happen, or not finding that out after in advance?
That's a good question. We do hold agencies accountable for knowing what is on their network, and if there's been a directive to remove actions and a specific date by which to act, we are holding them accountable from an oversight perspective.
Mr. Dodaro, do you have any opinions on this? Critical infrastructure, supply chain within the .gov space, right? Let's start with that.
Yeah, right. Now, I think, individual agencies are always the first line of responsibility in these cases to know what they're buying and what is in place. DHS has responsibility and has the ability to issue binding operational directives to agencies that across government, if need be, to remove devices or to do certain things as well. So DHS has some responsibilities. I'd ask Greg to come up. He just testified on his supply chain issue recently. See if he has any additional thoughts.
While he's coming up, describe your vision, the future state that needs to happen in order for this to be removed from the GAO high-risk report.
On supply chain
on supply chain over .gov.
Yeah. There needs to be, a clearer plan for determining the supply chain operations, in terms of identification of vulnerabilities, and there needs to be greater accountability for enforcing that over
Who should do that?
It's got to be led by DHS or out of the White House to be enforced. I mean, it has to be. I mean, and there's separate issues at DOD, all right, on this issue, for national security purposes, and they hold the prime contractors responsible, but there's a lot of subcontractor kind of issues. So, but in the civilian side of the government, I think it's got to come from DHS primarily. It would be where I would start.
Mr. Wilshushin?
Yes, it would need to be, I think, also DHS, but also certainly with input and collaboration with the intel community as well as DOD as they collect intelligence and information about the particular supply chain threat to particular components or systems that might be in use at federal agencies. DHS has used its authority under the Federal Information Security Modernization Act to issue binding operational directives to require and compel all federal agencies to remove Kaspersky Lab-type products, as was referenced earlier. We have been requested, and we plan to start an engagement later this year to look at the process by which DHS determines when to issue a binding operational directive, how it comes about that decision, and then what oversight mechanisms it has to ensure that its directives are actually being implemented and implemented effectively by the agencies.
Shifting gears on privacy, if the IRS database got hacked and, let's say, a portion of American citizens' information was stolen, what is the responsibility of IRS to notify those individuals, notify Congress? What is the breach notification rules that IRS would be following in that case?
IRS, it depends. IRS would need to make, and this is under guidance provided by the Office of Management and Budget, indeed, on how to respond to particular data breaches. Part of it is to conduct first a risk assessment in which it looks at the scope of the breach and the potential harm that could occur to, say, in this case, taxpayers, if their information is indeed compromised. And then it's supposed to make a risk assessment and then determine what type of actions to take. Part of that could include notification to those individuals that their information has been breached. It could also include providing some other remedies, such as credit monitoring services and other.
So this is a standard written by OMB?
That's correct.
So if students' loan information at Department of Education was stolen, would that be the same notification responsibilities and process?
Yes, those guidelines are for all federal agencies.
So OMB has issued breach standard notification across the federal government to include intel and military. Is it across all federal agencies, or is it just the .gov space?
Well, I guess that would be .gov space.
Ms. Kent, do you have any opinions on this topic?
It is not a topic that I'm familiar with all the specifics. I do recognize, though, in the description is the process is very similar to industry in the notification process, identifying risk, understanding the risk of the individuals, and then determining if there are other mitigating factors that should be offered to those individuals.
Ms. Kent, changing gears here, OMB releases agency self-reported data on the status of their information security controls. We have found that agencies tend to present a prettier picture than their own IGs in those Fisma audits. Have you noticed this discrepancy? Are you working to make this accurate reporting? Are you acknowledging these problems? How do we plan to work with agencies to implement some of these basic cybersecurity requirements?
I concur with your assessment. That was actually, when I looked at the reports, one of the early things that I asked in joining. It's actually a conversation that I've had with the GAO team about how we can automate and actually extract data on some of those specific points versus asking for a self-reporting mechanism. And we'll continue the dialogue about how to improve that.
And this is one of my final questions. It's a very broad, basic question, and it's broad and basic for a reason. And we'll start with you, Ms. Kent, and then we'll go down the line. Who's responsible for defending the digital infrastructure of the federal government? Who is responsible for defending the digital infrastructure of the federal government?
The agencies are responsible for defending the digital infrastructure at their agency, and DHS is responsible for defending across the enterprise, and there's an interlock of responsibilities between the agencies and their communication with DHS, and ensuring that DHS has visibility to issues, incidents, and what they are detecting going on in those individual agencies.
What is the role of the federal government in helping to defend the 16 areas that we consider to be critical infrastructure?
I don't know that I'm following your question. Are you talking about the external industry?
So the 16 areas that we think are critical infrastructure, financial services, utilities, election infrastructure, go down the line, what is the federal government's role in helping to defend those infrastructures?
I see those as the responsibility of DHS, so I don't know that I am informed to comment. DHS and our National Security Council. And from a federal agency perspective, I know when we expect that they are sharing threat information from those industries with us inside the federal agency side so that we can react to those.
Gotcha. Mr. Dodaro, who's in charge?
Well, in the federal space, I would agree. I mean, the agencies are primary responsibility according to Fisma. It's the agency heads. I mean, it's Congress has established that in law. It's given DHS responsibility in law. You know, OMB sort of passed that responsibility to DHS years ago, and without the authority. Now, Congress corrected that and gave DHS the authority, gives them the ability to issue these binding operational directives. And then OMB has responsibility as well for policy matters in a lot of these areas. So in the federal space, I think that's pretty clear. In the critical infrastructure protection space, less so. Now, in some of the critical infrastructures, for example, in the nuclear area, there are regulatory responsibilities. So the federal government role is a little clearer in that area. They have more authority to put in place requirements. But for by and large, for most of the 16 sectors for critical infrastructure, it's voluntary. And what we found is that each has a federal coordination point, and a lot of the federal coordinators really didn't know what the status was of implementation of the voluntary standards. When we talked to a number of people in the sectors, you know, they were basically saying that they had challenges. They didn't have enough people. They didn't understand all the requirements. So that's the area I'm most concerned about.
So describe that future state when it comes to critical infrastructure, that if we achieved, you would pull this off as one of the 4 major challenges facing the federal government.
Yeah, well, number one, I'd have to have some metrics and measures to know what the state of readiness really is in those areas. Right now, you don't have that. No one can answer that question, I believe, to say across the 16 sectors we're ready. And here's why I believe that. So to me, you need that in place to provide the level of assurance that would be necessary in order to do that. And so that's, you know, a tall order. And then you would need to have, you know, a clearer understanding of information sharing. You know, our understanding of what's going on, you referenced this earlier about businesses being happy with the information they're getting from DHS. I'm not too sure that that information flow is going 2 ways. And I think we need to, from the federal government standpoint, need to have greater assurance that there's a 2-way dialogue here, and that we're really communicating and understanding what's going on with the risk in those areas. So to me, you need a clear metric understanding of what the status of readiness is for each of the 16 areas, and there would be different metrics for different sectors. I'm not suggesting there'd just be one, but somebody's got to be in that position to know that. And right now, that's very sketchy at best, and as a result, I think we're very vulnerable in the nation. I know there's a lot of policy issues about, you know, with federal role, respecting the private sector, or whatever, but I think we're getting to a point with the threats from state and non-state actors that we need to have more of a grown-up conversation about the real risk to the country in those areas, and a coming of the meeting of the minds on how best to protect our country for everybody.
Has GAO designed a number or thought through what are those doomsday scenarios that we should be prepared for? Because if there are unclear roles between the public and private sector in response to a doomsday scenario, we need to be thinking through what are those doomsday scenarios that we need to be prepared for. Have you all spent some time on that? Have you all seen an entity that has designed that? Ms. Kent, have you seen stuff? I know there are some exercises, DHS does a few, but I feel like we haven't done enough, because if we're truly going to skate to a future state, we need to figure out what that is we're trying to be prepared for. If we're going to develop contingency planning, what contingency are we planning for? And Mr. Schuson, you came up here, so I hope you have some interesting things to say.
Well, I hope I can interest you. One is the DHS has developed a response plan and it's tested annually, in which it is tests against different types of scenarios. And I do believe in some of the guidance, at least from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and some of its guidance, it does identify different threat scenarios for different types of potential attacks that can affect organizations and systems. Now, that's generally guided towards federal agencies, but those same types of attacks can also be applied against critical infrastructure owners and operators in the systems that they operate. And so there are different threat scenarios that have been identified, and those are things that both, I think, DHS and the Nist has identified.
Well, Mr. Dodaro, you've heard me say this before. I'm a big fan of GAO. Whenever there's a new topic I am working on, I always start with whatever reports you all have developed. So thank you for you and your team and y'all's service to making sure our government is responsive to the people that we serve. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Ms. Kent, any final words?
I thank you for the opportunity, and as I said in the opening, every chance that we have to elevate the conversation around cybersecurity and the resources that we need to be in a position to protect our security posture, I greatly appreciate. Thank you.
Well, I thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stand adjourned.